Hi, welcome back to CS170 fall session. So this week is the week of October 4th, your sixth week. We also have exam coming up. So if we look here, we have chapter 6 and 18. So chapter 6 is going to cover more like the debugging. And then chapter 18 is covering your basic intro to JavaScript. Remember last week we started covering variables and whatnot. So those are basically your foundational blocks. So we'll actually walk through how to create some interactions with JavaScript right now. You can see here, we have the hourly exam. You probably will see announcements related to sample exam, the timing, also how the proctoring will work for the exam. If there's any questions on that, send your TAs or myself some email. I believe there's also been extra review sessions or lab hours and whatnot for people to drop in if there's any questions about the things that will be on exam 1. But I believe if you look at the syllabus, you look at the resources and whatnot, it does give a pretty detailed view of what to expect for exam 1. So hopefully everyone is good and ready for that, and good luck with that. I think I should be doing proctoring for one of the hours during that exam. But anyway, good luck with that. Let me come back to here. So this is your different sections. Here's October 4th. I posted up the sample HTML file and then the slides here. Okay, so actually while I'm here, let me take that HTML file down because I know I had a problem with this last time. So do the right mouse button, or if you're doing a MacBook, you do like the double finger. Take it down. And I'm going to save chapter 18 events. So you'll be able to download this. Okay. And I opened this up in Notepad++. And you can see all this does is basically set you up. So it basically has like, basically what you have for your HTML here at the beginner part. So you don't have to type this over again. Your HTML info, your body. But notice here, right? So we set up in the head. And then we did the style, right? So you guys all know this from like the CSS. This is how you would set, your background color, your fonts and whatever, right? To how you want that style to be, right? So this is the overall body. And you're setting all of these different attributes, right? So the background color, the font here, the color of the text itself, and you're doing a center alignment here. And then for your P tag, you're just doing this one font size thing. Obviously, you can do other things, but this is just a sample here. So hopefully you're actually familiar with all this because this actually is going to get picked up for your exam upcoming, right, on CSS. Okay, and you also did it for your assignment, albeit that you picked it up from your style sheet, right? So you included the style sheet up here in the head, and that applied similar types of, formatting or styles across all of the tags that you ultimately put into your body. Okay, so this is kind of old hat for you, but this saves you from having to type this stuff in, I guess. Okay, and just so you can see what it looks like, let me just open this up, and there you go. Right, so we didn't put anything in the body yet, so obviously all you see is just blue here. Okay, but we'll start to add some stuff to it. Okay, let me see here. So this is that. Let me get back to here. Okay, so like the one bit about chapter 6 is not really much of a slide for it. It's more of like talking about debugging and whatnot. So I think, probably a couple concepts you should make sure you know from the debugging side of things is the difference between a runtime error, a compile time error, and a logic error. Okay, and this kind of sums it up here, right? So a runtime error means that you're not actually seeing the issue until you actually run the program, right? And oftentimes that's based on, maybe something that you input, right? Maybe you're expecting a number and someone puts in a string, right? And then that will blow up the program, right? So that's kind of like a runtime error. Okay. A compile time error means like, whatever you put in there is so totally flat out wrong that you catch it before you could even run the program, right? So it kind of will highlight right there and then, right? And so there's all different kinds of validators and stuff like that that can kind of help you catch more and more stuff more before you actually start to run the program. But basically it's just the timing of when you catch the issue, right? So you catch it more at the very beginning, whereas the runtime, you only catch the issue when you're actually, putting in some input or you hit a certain condition, and then it's not something that the program can handle properly, and then it just blows up. The logic issue, the logic error is probably the biggest or trickiest thing sometimes, right? When you look at certain loops, sometimes like, based on what you see there, it looks perfectly fine. And syntactically, it's fine, right? But then you hit certain conditions and then it just goes to infinity, right? Or gives you just something unexpected, right? So even though syntactically it's correct, it doesn't behave the way you would like, right? So that's called a logic error. Okay, and those are probably the more tricky things to try and capture. Okay, but you can read more about it. The only comment I would say about with the debugging and whatnot, and it kind of applies, and I'll talk you through a little bit as we start to do more of the JavaScript stuff. I think it's more easy to look at certain things when you're looking at something like JavaScript. You break it up in smaller chunks. You put essentially like print statements in there to look at certain variables to make sure you're doing certain things. Sometimes you look at the code, it looks like it should be working correctly, but until you actually look at what's inside those variables, you realize that actually, something is wrong. Maybe you define something to capture a string and it was a number in there, or you thought you stored a value in there, but actually you didn't, right? Things like that. So it's good to break things down. Like a lot of times where I see a lot of errors is where people are putting like very complicated nested if statements, let's say. And they lose track of like, the different blocks, and they start to like, the logic gets all screwed up. So, I mean, my suggestion is anytime you have like complex, you know, logic, put it in little by little and make sure it's kind of behaving the way you would expect it, and then just keep on extending on top of that, as opposed to like just trying to type everything all in at once and then seeing that it doesn't work, right? A lot of times JavaScript, you catch things out because it's case sensitive, or you didn't like block things out correctly. Notably things like, if conditions, they kind of get all jumbled up, especially if you don't like tab them over and make sure they line up, so it's easier for you to understand things. Okay, so debugging, there's some debugging tools, there's some things to do like what you saw with the HTML validator. All those type of things can help you, right? Even like what I was talking about with Notepad++, there's other editors do similar type of things too, right? But like, for example, you remember sometimes I said, sometimes we don't close off the tags properly, right? So you can click on one, let's say the head, and you'll see the other one here. Make sure you close that off, right? Same thing with the body, let's say. Okay. So I think that's all I want to say about debugging. It's a little bit tricky, and there's a reason why you don't have a computer automatically be able to debug your code, right? There's like a little bit of like creativity or experience to be able to debug some of the more complex scenarios, right? And we'll talk a little bit more why computers don't automatically debug code for you. Okay. All right. So this is chapter 18 events HTML file. That's what I put into my page that I downloaded, so you can do the same thing. And this is exactly what's on there, right? So that's what this is here. Okay. So this is what you have here. So you can take that from mine and use that as your starting thing, or you can just type this in yourself just so you can get the experience to type this in. That's your choice. Okay. And you can play around it. We're not really turning this in for an assignment, but for me, from an extra credit perspective, since you're doing this work, I don't mind if you want to turn this in as your extra credit when we do the final thing near this at the bottom. Okay, so we'll work together. We'll build up all of this JavaScript, and then whatever you come out with here at the bottom, you can send that to me as part of your extra credit via email. Okay, so let's get going with this. So here, this is what a screen would look like after we implement what we call text boxes. These text boxes, for the way we're using it, this is a very basic way to do things. In practice, you probably wouldn't see things exactly like this. So this is more just for, in this case, our class, right? Which is not really meant for hardcore computer science folks. So we're not going to use more of the advanced input and output features of JavaScript. This is very basic. One of them is the text box, right? So the text box in this case here, the top part where it says Fran, where you enter your name, that's more for your input. And then down here, we're using this text box to print out your output here. Okay, so this is your input output. Okay, like I said, in practice, we don't actually implement your input output this way in JavaScript, but for like beginner and just to give you the feel for how these things might work, this is sufficient. So let's work with this. Okay. So I'm going to put this into the HTML file in a second, but I just kind of show you what this looks like. So notice this is within the body. Okay. And of course you have all the background here, right? And then you have the header, right, which is up here. Then you have a couple of breaks, and then you start off a new P here, paragraph. And we want to say enter your name, and you want to do the carriage return. And here's where we get into the text box here. Okay, so all of this is all together here into this one thing like that. Okay, so let's break that down. Okay, so here it is just setting the style, right? And look, we're saying input here, right? And all that is just, the syntax for this, right? Like I said, over here, we're actually going to be using this more for output, right? But so we still call it input here. And we're saying this is text, and then this is the name. And notice we're giving it a name in camel case, right? So we're calling it text box and name. So it kind of is like what we're talking about, like conventions to naming your variables so that they're useful, right? So here we're saying this is a text box, and we're saying that it's going to have something to do with a name, right? In this case, we're taking an input of name, okay? And then the value means we're setting it to blank. So we could set it to something else, right? So notice down here at the bottom, we set the value to say hello, okay? But in this case, we're setting it to blank because we want someone to put their name in there, right? And then we're setting the size here to be 20, okay? And then here's an important concept here, on change. On change is part of what you call event-driven programming, right? So on change is when you say something happens. In this case, it's changing the value within that text box, right? But it could be a button, right? So on click is another event. When you have a button, you click on that, and that fires off your code to do something, right? On click. In this case, when you say it's text box on change, that means we're going to do something, right? And what we're going to do here is you see this text box hello.value. So remember here, we said text box.name, we set the value to be blank, initialized it to be blank. Now we're saying text box.hello, text box hello.value, which is this box down here, equals to text box hello.value, because this value had a hello in here at the beginning, right? Plus the text box name.value of whatever you typed in here, right? This is the text box name, okay? And then it will display something down here, right? And then you have all this stuff which I just explained up here. So let's take all of that and let's stick that in here. So I'm gonna take this, I'm gonna put it over to where we had the HTML, and I just paste it in here. Okay, but you see it's exactly the same thing what I just put in. So JavaScript here under the H1, couple returns, I define these text boxes like so, right? All right, so let's see what happens here. I'm gonna save this, and where's my browser at? Yeah, okay, I gotta open this. Okay. Okay. So you see what happened here. I typed it in here and then it displays it out here. Okay, so this is something that you can do on your chapter 18 event HTML, and that's what you should see. Okay, fair enough. All right, so let's continue on here. All right, so try to understand what I just talked about here in terms of text boxes. Okay, how do I define it? How do I initialize it? How do I program something, in this case on change, which is event-driven programming, to do something? Okay, these are all important things. You're going to need to know this for your assignment. Okay. Okay, so let's move on. So the next thing is a button. All right, and a button is the same thing. You can see the input type here, and then we're going to call it button 1, which is not great. We probably shouldn't call it button 1, but that's what we're working with right now. And then we're saying the value is click me. So value click me in this case is saying what is the value that you display on the button here. Okay, so because a button, you're not actually doing input and output, right? So there's no reason why you would have a value equals to blank like you did on the text box up here. Okay, so in this case, when you're doing a button, type button, you're going to be doing the value to show what is on the label of the button, right? What you see there, in this case, click me. Okay, and then when you do the click, this is an event, right? On click, then you're going to do an alert, hello world. So it's going to pop up a little box that says hello world. So very quickly, let's put that in here. Back to here. I'm going to put that, let's say, here. Okay, I'm not really lining it up. I'm just kind of pasting stuff in here. And let's go over to here. Let's refresh this. And now you have clicked me over here, right? And then I hit that, and then it pops up this alert box. And so this is one of those things I was telling you about before. This is like your print statement. You can do this to this alert box to basically print out the values of your variables, let's say. Okay, so you print that out, and it helps you to debug things in case you didn't really see what you expect. You didn't see the behavior that you expect to see, right? But that's something you can add in here. So hello world is just a simple little alert box here. But in the future, if you want to use debugging very quickly, you can just put in like a variable in here to display the variable instead of putting in this hard-coded text here to say hello world. Okay, let's go back to here. So that's a button. Okay, the next thing is a radio button. Radio button is something like this, right? You can choose between apples, bananas, and peaches. Okay, and they define it here. So what do you need to do to really enable a radio button? Of course, number one, you have this, right? You have to say it's a type radio. Okay, but the other thing is, you notice here, you need to call all of them the same thing, right? So it's name equals to fruit. That ties them all together. Okay, and then they just set up like different values here for each of the different radio button values, right? So it's just A, B, C. Probably not the best thing to call it, but fine. Okay, so it's A, B, C, and then in this case, the value is either apples, bananas, or peaches, is what you see over here. Okay, but the actual text for it is actually this right here. You see the apples here, bananas, and peaches, right? So what happens is let's say in this case, I selected peaches, right? Well, how do I understand like that value, that's the value that got selected, right? And that's where you get the value from, okay? Um, so in this case, they display the peaches, right? Um, and this is like the input down here, right? So you have the input, remember this is a text box, right? And then the ID is, they just call it box one here like this, right? But now look what happens here. You can see like the on click event. So I clicked on, in this case, let's say I clicked on apples, right? And then it would say the box one dot value, which is this is box one dot value, right? Equals to value, right? And what's value? This is your variable, right? Value is apples, right? So that's what's happening. So depending on which of these radio buttons I click, there's an on click event that gets generated. And then it will go to the box one dot value and set it to the value, which is this, okay? Now that's one way you could have done this. Instead of using the value to peaches, you could have just easily just say, well, let me just put peaches right here and put bananas right here and apples right here, right? But they're kind of just set up like this so that you can see that we're using this idea of value for each of the radio button values here, okay? Like I said, if you're gonna do the population like this with the on click for each of the radio buttons, you didn't really need to use values. You could have just put apples right here or bananas here or peaches here, okay? But I think there's a good demonstration of you referring to this value here, right? Because let's say you're doing something else outside, you want to look at this value, then you refer to it a value. You couldn't just hard code it like this, you know, box one dot value equals to peaches, let's say over here, right? So it is good to have your value set over here like this, depending on your choice here. So let me take this and put it onto my code. Okay, and let's see what we get here. All right, and so I click on apples, I get apples, bananas, and peaches. Okay, so that's how radio buttons work. So note what I said about what's important to make a radio button work, right? Between defining the radio button, naming all of them to be the same, right? And then how you take the value from each one of these radio buttons when you select it. And remember with a radio button, when you select it, you can only choose one, right? So I could only pick peaches here. When I click on apples, then the peaches automatically gets unclicked, okay? All right, so the last bit here we're going to be talking about is converting, let's say, your Fahrenheit temperature to a Celsius temperature. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to take your text box, you're going to have your input for your Fahrenheit, you're going to store that and do a calculation on that, right? And then based on your button, your on click, you're going to populate your text box here for your output for your Celsius, okay? And actually, before I do that, let me just come back here for a second. Note this part here, when I did the output, I set the read only on here, okay? This is part of like how we make it so that this is only for output. And you'll see the same thing when we're down here with this Fahrenheit to Celsius conversion, okay? So that's what this looks like here, okay? So you can see, of course, we have the input for your Fahrenheit. Of course, you have a text box here, okay? And we call it an F box. A little quick shortcut there, and we initialize it to be blank, okay? All right, so that's fine. So then we can capture whatever number you want, okay? And then you have here, this is the button. Now we have the input, you have a button here, okay? This was a good name for it, right? Calculate button, sounds fair enough. And then the value, remember what I said the value was. The value is what appears on the label of the button, calculate Celsius, right? Calculate Celsius. And then the on click, what are we gonna do? Well, we're gonna take the variable F degrees right? So we're declaring a variable f degrees, and we're initializing it or setting it to be, what is this number, right? Number of this f box value, okay? So when you type in like something into this text box here, the computer doesn't really know, is it a number? Is it a string? Okay, so you might type in 123. It looks like a number to you, but from a computer standpoint, it doesn't know. Maybe it's the characters 123. So when you have this number here, you're basically casting it or setting it to be a number. Now, of course, if you put in a text, a real text like ABC, that's a problem, right? That's an invalid value. And you can put like some error handling or some error checks there to say, hey, you can't put in like a number, or you can't put in a string, I should say. But in this case, we're trying to keep it simple here. Let's assume that you punch in a real number there, 123 or something, right? But you still need to tell the computer that you're working with a number. So that's why you have this number here with the open paren, close paren around the f box value. And then var Celsius degrees, now we declared a variable to store the Celsius value. It's going to basically take the f degrees, which is your Fahrenheit temperature, minus 32 times 5/9. Okay, and that's basically the calculation to convert Fahrenheit to Celsius, right? Once you get that value, then you're going to do your C box, which is your text box to hold in your Celsius number. And there's another function that's available to you when you're working with a number, okay, is this toFixed, right? So your variable is C degrees, but when you put this dot here, there's some built-in functions. One of them is this toFixed, and what this does is it takes it out 2 decimals, okay? And that's just kind of built in with any variables that's a number there, okay? And I just moved this by accident, so I'm going to put this back here, okay? And then it just has the print down here, okay? So let me put this into our code here. Okay. And then we run it, and then we have this, right? So let's see what happens when I type in ABC. So you get NaN, right? Not a number, okay? Which is true, right? You can't calculate a conversion off of ABC, right? But let's do a conversion off of like 33 degrees Celsius, I mean Fahrenheit, I should say. Now we calculate and we get 0.56. So notice what happened here, right? We have a dot and then we have 5.6, which means we took it out 2 decimal places. Okay, and that was what the logic was I was explaining here with this toFixed. Okay. So basically that's your intro to JavaScript. That's talking about us working with text boxes, working with buttons, doing stuff, doing actions based off of events, working with radio buttons, and putting all that together to calculate your Celsius. Okay. So like I said, for your extra credit this week, I think it would be good if you would take what we just did and kind of reproduce it on your own. Okay, so try to type it in, try to get everything to work. A lot of these things that you see in terms of working with text boxes, your radio buttons and hitting the buttons and whatnot is exactly what you're going to end up be doing on your assignment for JavaScript. So it's important that you understand how all these things work. Okay, so give it a shot. This will be your extra credit for this week. Take advantage of the lab hours and reviews for your upcoming exam. If there's any questions, send us email, or we'll actually ideally put it out onto Piazza. And we'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. Okay. All right. Good luck with your exam, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.